Hello, and welcome to English for Philosophy students. We are studying Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. We're in our third lesson of rule number 6. And I believe it is the 45th lesson overall. In order to get back into the argument of this rule, I want to do a short recap of where we are in the chapter. So, the title of this chapter is Set Your House in Perfect Order Before You Criticize the World. And it begins by basically pointing out that there is a spirit of hatred and destruction. It was articulated by Mephistopheles, the devil, in the German play Faust. It is simple destruction and hatred of all that God has created. Peterson talks about how this angry, hateful attitude is common in mankind, especially when we have been hurt. But not only when we have been hurt. Really, he asserts that this attitude resides in all people to some extent. And he begins by speaking of boys who shot lots of students at their school, and then he goes on to point out, that in fact, life sucks right here. And because life is so difficult and the world that God has made is so harsh that it is almost impossible to escape the attitude of nihilism, of anger, of hatred of reality. And the last thing we talked about last week in the section we were reading was the attitude of Tolstoy. Tolstoy was unable to resolve the conflict in his mind. He was a good and faithful man, but he saw how harsh reality was and how much suffering there was in the world, and it made him want to kill or die. And it says here that he had to hide his guns from himself and not walk with a rope in his hand in case he would hang himself. And Jordan Peterson said that Tolstoy did not go far enough because suicide is almost a weak response to the evil of the world. What is more consistent would be murder. In fact, murder which attacks God, which attacks the creator of the universe. Murder of all things good, just to spite God. This would be a consistent, strong response, courageous response to the evil of being. So that brings us to where we begin tonight. And tonight we begin a section called Vengeance or Transformation. And let us look at the sentence that leads us in, the transition. It says, how can a person who is awake avoid outrage at the world? So this is very similar to the question we were considering last week. How can a person who is awake escape from the torture, the mental torture of living in such a horrible universe with so much injustice, so many innocent people suffering? I can understand this when I think about my emotional response if I see an innocent child hurt by a bad person, by a cruel person. I can't even watch. I go, and I don't even want to think about it. If it's in my head, it tortures me. And if you could multiply that one incident by 1 billion, then you realize the magnitude of the problem of innocent people suffering for no reason. How can a person who is sensitive and awake and aware live with it? So that is the question. Now we move to our chapter, our subchapter, our portion of the chapter entitled Vengeance or Transformation. So let us read. A religious man might shake his fist in desperation at the apparent injustice and blindness of God. Even Christ himself felt abandoned before the cross, or so the story goes. A more agnostic or atheistic individual might blame fate or meditate bitterly on the brutality of chance. Another might tear himself apart, searching for the character flaws underlying his suffering and deterioration. These are all variations on a theme. The name of the target changes, but the underlying psychology remains constant. Why? Why? Why is there so much suffering and cruelty? Let us go back and read it again more slowly. Okay, so the question is, how can a person who is awake avoid outrage at the world? So a person who is awake is looking at the terrible things. What is their response? A religious man might shake his fist in desperation at the apparent injustice and blindness of God. Okay, so shaking his fist is usually an aggressive act. It's usually threatening and angry. But he says shake his fist in desperation. This is a religious man. So a religious man, A, believes in God, so he believes it is created, and 2, he has faith that God is good. But when he sees the injustice, he shakes his fist at God, desperate not to lose his own faith, desperate to find some justification for all this terrible stuff. He is desperate because he is about to lose his faith over it. And in desperation at the apparent injustice and blindness of God. Apparent means the appearance of blindness and injustice. When you add the word apparent, you are actually casting doubt on the truth of what you're saying. So he doesn't say he shakes his fist at the injustice and blindness of God as a fact. He says he shakes his fist at the apparent injustice and blindness, which leaves room that perhaps the appearance is deceiving. So this word apparent weakens the claim that God is actually blind or actually unjust. It leaves room for hope that what appears to be unjust will in the end prove to be just and fair. And that what appears to be blindness of God will in the end prove to be not blindness, but careful attention and reasoned action. We just can't see the reason. Okay, then he goes on to say, even Christ himself felt abandoned before the cross. It doesn't say was abandoned, it said felt abandoned. In other words, there was the appearance that God had abandoned him, yet we know God did not abandon him. And then secondly, we have, or so the story goes. That phrase casts doubt again. It weakens the assertion that God abandoned him. It weakens it even further. As the story goes, suggests that maybe the story is wrong. Okay? Maybe Jesus didn't feel abandoned, or maybe Jesus didn't really think God had abandoned him. A more agnostic or atheistic individual might blame fate or meditate bitterly on the brutality of chance. So now we're talking about an agnostic or an atheist. Someone who doesn't believe in God is going to be angry at fate or chance. But they still will be angry at something or someone. You think if they don't believe in God and they only believe in random chance, maybe they won't be angry at anyone. But that is not the case. The truth is, it is in the human heart to be angry at something. If you don't believe in God, you're angry at fate, which is meaningless, or you are angry at chance, which is meaningless, because fate and chance are not persons. But yet, in the human heart, there is vengeance. I must be angry at someone who is responsible. Okay, so this was the agnostic or atheist. Now we have another person might tear himself apart, it says. Tear himself apart, searching for the character flaws underlying his suffering and deterioration. In other words, another person will search into himself, looking for some fault. That means he deserves it. I brought this on myself. It is my fault. And they will look and search and look until they find something within themselves that they can blame for the suffering. That they can say, oh, it's because I did this that this suffering came upon me. So, and then it says, these are all variations on a theme. Variations on a theme. In music, you can have a piece of music which is variations on a theme. So it takes one melody and sets it in many different styles, but the same melody comes through. Variations on a theme is an idea which is set in many different contexts, but ultimately it is the same idea. So you have the religious man blaming God, the atheist blaming fate, and the introspective man blaming self. But all are blaming someone for the suffering. The underlying psychology remains constant. The underlying psychology remains that they are looking for the reason why. They are saying, Why is there so much suffering? It is the fault of God. It is the fault of fate. It is the fault of my actions. The underlying question is, there must be a reason. What is the reason? There must be someone at fault. Who is at fault? Well, perhaps it really is God's doing. Okay, so now we are going to look at the three possibilities, probably. I'm guessing. I'm guessing from the structure of this that we have three possibilities. We have the religious man blaming God. We have the atheist or agnostic blaming fate. And then we have the introspective man blaming self. So now my expectation is we will have one paragraph or a couple of paragraphs focusing in on each option. I could be wrong. Let's see. So we will begin. And I think I'll get a different color. So we're going to go with pink for the first one. The religious man. Perhaps it really is God's doing. Maybe the religious man is right. Or it may be the fault of blind, pointless fate. Okay, maybe I am wrong. Maybe it's going to be all three in one. Perhaps it really is God's doing. Or the fault of blind, pointless fate, if you are inclined to think that way. And there appears to be every reason to think that way. But what happens if you do? Mass murderers believe that the suffering intended upon existence justifies judgment and revenge, as the Columbine boys so clearly indicated. Okay, so now he is saying, maybe they're right, the people who are saying it's God's fault or it's the fault of fate. It is the fault of existence. But, and when he says there appears every reason to think it, he's saying maybe this is true. It appears to solve the question of why, but it's not so good to think that way. What happens when you think that way? Well, mass murderers think that way. If you think that way, you may be tempted to become a mass murderer or act out against being destructively. Mass murderers believe that the suffering attendant on existence justifies judgment. So they're saying, life sucks. That's judgment. And they believe that it justifies judgment and revenge. Revenge is the action of destruction to get even with someone, as the Columbine boys so clearly indicated. And of course, the Columbine boys are the boys who shot their schoolmates. They said, I will sooner die than betray my own thoughts. Before I leave this worthless place, I will kill whoever I deem unfit for anything, especially life. If you pissed me off in the past, you will die if I see you. You might be able to piss off others and have it eventually blow over, but not me. I don't forget people who wronged me. Okay, this is what the boys wrote, or one of the boys wrote, and it was found on his computer, I suspect. I will sooner die than betray my own thoughts. So his thoughts were that being is bad and evil and meaningless, and everybody ought to be killed. And he will not betray this thought. He will act upon it. Before I leave this worthless place, the worthless place is earth and life. Our universe is the worthless place. Before I leave it, meaning die, I will kill whoever I deem unfit for anything, especially life. So this is judgment. He will be the judge of who he thinks is unfit for anything, especially unfit for life. If you pissed me off in the past, Pissed me off means annoyed me or made me angry in the past. You will die if I see you. If I see you means he was planning on bringing his gun to school and shooting whoever he saw and then killing himself. So he was only going to have one opportunity to kill people and then die. So if I see you, I will kill you. But if you pissed me off and I don't see you, well, I won't kill you. He can only kill the people he happens to see before he dies in this rampage. You might be able to piss off others and have it eventually blow over, but not me. Okay, piss off other people. So maybe you can annoy someone else and it will blow over, meaning they will forget, forgive you. It won't matter in time. In time will forgive it, but not if you piss off me. I will not forget and I will kill you if I see you. I don't forget people who wronged me. So this is their assertion of anger and vengeance. One of the most vengeful murderers of the 20th century, the terrible Karl Panzram, was raped, brutalized, and betrayed in the Minnesota institution responsible for his rehabilitation when he was a delinquent juvenile. He emerged enraged beyond measure as burglar, arsonist, rapist, and serial killer. He aimed consciously and consistently at destruction, even keeping track of the dollar value of the property he burned. He started by hating the individuals who had hurt him. His resentment grew until his hatred encompassed all of mankind, and he didn't stop there. His destructiveness was aimed in some fundamental manner at God himself. There is no other way of phrasing it. Panzram raped, murdered, and burned to express his outrage at being. He acted as if someone was responsible. The same thing happens in the story of Cain and Abel. Cain's sacrifices are rejected. He exists in suffering. He calls out God and challenges the being he created. God refuses his plea. He tells Cain that his trouble is self-induced. Cain, in his rage, kills Abel, God's favorite, and in truth be known, Cain's idol. Cain is jealous, of course, of his successful brother, but he destroys Abel primarily to spite God. This is the truest version of what happens when people take their vengeance to the ultimate extreme. So let's go back and read it one more time. One of the most vengeful murderers, vengeful means taking revenge on someone who has harmed you. So one of the most vengeful murderers of the 20th century, the terrible Karl Panzram, was raped, brutalized, and betrayed in the Minnesota institution responsible for his rehabilitation when he was a delinquent juvenile. So when a child or a teenager commits crimes, they cannot be sent to jail. If they're under maybe 16 years old, they go to juvenile rehabilitation or juvenile detention, and the conditions are not supposed to punish you. They're supposed to rehabilitate you or retrain you or somehow help you to stop being destructive. But instead of doing that, this place that he was sent betrayed him. Perhaps he trusted it. I don't know. I don't know the story. But they allowed him to be raped and brutalized. I don't know from this who did it, whether it was the other boys or officers or guards, somebody. He emerged enraged beyond measure. So when he got out of juvenile detention, he was so angry. He was enraged beyond measure. He was a burglar, arsonist, that's someone who sets fires to burn down houses. Burglar is a thief, arson, fire. Rapist, someone who rapes women. And serial killer. That means a killer who kills over and over again. That's what serial killer means. He aimed consciously and consistently at destruction. So, in other words, he was not just acting out of blind anger and passion. He consciously tried to destroy as much as possible, and he consistently, every time, he tried to destroy as much as possible. So he aimed at destruction. Even keeping track of the dollar value of the property he burned. Keeping track means keeping a record. So at any moment you could say, how much have you destroyed? And he would know the amount of money, the amount of value in dollars of the goods he had burned. He started by hating the individuals who had hurt him. His resentment grew until his hatred encompassed all of mankind, and he didn't stop there. So in the beginning, he hated only those who had hurt him, but the hatred in him grew until he ended up hating everybody. And even he didn't stop there. He went on to aim his destructiveness in a fundamental matter at God. There is no other way of phrasing it. Panzram raped, murdered, and burned to express his outrage at being, meaning at the universe that God has created for us. He acted as if someone with a capital S, like God or a personified fate or whatever, a person, was responsible for all the suffering and evil in creation. The same thing happens in the story of Cain and Abel from the Bible. Cain's sacrifices are rejected. I think you know the story. We told this story some other time, maybe last week. Cain's sacrifices are rejected. He exists in suffering. He calls out God. To call out someone is to point out their bad behavior. When I first read this, I thought it said he calls out to God. If it said he calls out to God, he would be going, "Oh God, help me." That is calling out to God. But it doesn't say that. It says he calls out God. Call out is a phrasal verb meaning to confront with someone's evil. It means to, like, if I'm going to call out God, I'm going to say, God, you are unjust. You are wrong. That is calling someone out. So he calls out God and challenges the being he created. What this means is Cain, he calls out God saying, God, you are wrong. And he challenges the conditions. He says, God is unjust. He is challenging the goodness of the universe, which was created by God. So he is challenging the universe, the goodness of the universe, i.e. being, that was created by God. So he calls out God and challenges the being that God created. God refuses his plea. He tells Cain that his trouble is self-induced. Cain said, God, it's your fault. God said, Cain, it's your fault. Cain, in his rage, his anger, kills Abel, who is God's favorite. That's how you know he's ultimately acting out at God, not at Abel. He doesn't really hold Abel responsible. God is responsible. So he kills God's favorite person. And, truth be known, it's Cain's idol. That means Abel is the one Cain admires and wants to be like, and maybe is jealous of. Cain is jealous, of course, of his successful brother, but he destroys Abel primarily to spite God. So he is jealous. That is a reason to kill him, but that's not the reason he killed him. He kills him to spite God. Now, what happened? Hold on. This is the truest version of what happens when people take their vengeance to the ultimate extreme. They are actually trying to hurt the creator of being. Let's read on. Panzram's response, that is, he emerged from the institution enraged and began acting out against the creator of being by destroying everything, killing, burning, raping. So Panzram's response was perfectly understandable. I skipped this portion because it is in parentheses. We will add it in now. And this is what was so terrible. Panzram's response was, and this is what was so terrible, perfectly understandable. So it means it is terrible to realize that Panzram's response was perfectly understandable. We don't have to say Panzram was crazy. We can say Panzram was justified. In light of what happened to him, of course, he is going to be terribly angry and become destructive. That's what he's saying. The details of his autobiography reveal that he was one of Tolstoy's strong and logically consistent people. Remember, last week, Tolstoy said that the only reason not to commit suicide is because you are too weak and cowardly. If you were strong and consistent, you would definitely commit suicide. And so, and then Jordan Peterson said, not only suicide, but also murder. So Panzram, being a murderer, is Tolstoy's ideal, strong, consistent person. So he, meaning Panzram, was a powerful, consistent, fearless actor. By actor, he doesn't mean like movie star or actor on a stage. He means a person who does what he believes. He acts upon his convictions. He had the courage of his own convictions. He had the courage of his convictions. If a person has the courage of their convictions, that means they are going to do what they believe in because they believe it strongly and consistently, and they are brave enough to do it. If a person doesn't have the courage of their convictions, then they will hide, they will maybe do in secret what they believe in, but publicly they will just toe the party line. So if someone says he has the courage of his convictions, it means he believes something strongly enough that he's going to act in the face of all the blowback that will come as a result. So Panzram has the courage of his convictions. How could someone like him be expected to forgive and forget, given what had happened to him? So Jordan Peterson is beginning this section by saying, a person who is so abused cannot be expected to forgive. It would be crazy. Truly terrible things happen to people. It is no wonder they're out for revenge. Under such conditions, vengeance seems a moral necessity. Here we have that seems again. Maybe it's not, it's apparently a moral necessity, but maybe the appearance is deceiving. Maybe it's not a moral necessity to take vengeance. So, under such conditions, meaning when someone has been cruel to you, to take vengeance back seems like a moral necessity. How can it be distinguished from the demand for justice? So, if you come and punch me in the face and I do nothing to you back, that is unjust. You should be punched back. That is only fair. That's how it seems. It seems like I have an obligation to punch you back. Otherwise, you will not be punished for what you did, and that is wrong. So, he is making the statement that taking revenge seems like a moral necessity. It seems like it is the only way to get justice. After the experience of terrible atrocity, isn't forgiveness just cowardice or lack of willpower? So, if you come up and punch me and I don't punch you, maybe I'm afraid of you, or I'm just not willing to punch back, getting justice, knowing that you will then fight me and I'll be hurt more. So it's weakness or fear or cowardice. Those are the reasons for not taking revenge, according to this. Such questions torment me. This is Jordan Peterson talking. Apparently, this philosophical reverie is Jordan Peterson's. As Jordan Peterson thinks, is it not unjust for us to let the bad guy win, to forgive? How can that be just? How can that be correct? This torments Jordan Peterson. But people emerge from terrible pasts to do good and not evil, although such an accomplishment can seem superhuman. So this entire section that we have done today, everything we have done today, is supporting the thesis that if it is true that the world sucks and that being as God has created it is unfair, meaningless, harsh, filled with evil and suffering, and innocent people being hurt and killed and suffering more, so much so that it's better to die than to live. then it would certainly be better to be a murderer and a suicide. And if you don't take vengeance against God for creating such a horrible place, then there's something wrong with you. You are unjust, you are weak, you are cowardly. I have encountered some very thoughtful people, one in particular I'm thinking, but actually several, who say, God claims that he sends people to hell if they don't believe in him. Hell is so terrible, a place of eternal torment. If God would send a person to eternal torment, that is so cruel and so bad that God must be a monster. And if you worship a God who is willing to torture someone eternally, you're a monster. The only way you can rise above such horrible evil is to reject and hate and call out God. We should call out God for such a horrible concept. But then they go on to say, truly, a God like that could not exist anyway, so I don't believe in him. But if I did, I would hate him, despise him. So either God does not exist or he is evil, beyond the worst evil we can conceive of, because he's the one who created all this terrible stuff, and hell on top of it, hell, a place of eternal torment. So in that sense, they believe that they are morally superior to God because they see how terrible God is for what he has done. And they become nihilists, and according to Jordan Peterson and Tolstoy, the logically consistent response would be to destroy the universe and shake your fist at God as you die. Curse God and die was the advice given to Job by Job's wife. Job's wife told him, curse God and die because you are miserable. That's in the book of Job in the Bible. But at the very end of this section, Jordan Peterson brings up the alternative response. But, he says, people emerge from terrible pasts to do good and not evil, although such an accomplishment can seem superhuman. So now, if you remember, the title of this section is Vengeance or Transformation. So the beginning of it was all about vengeance. The second half will be about transformation. Let's take a quick look at the size of this section. Okay, the section goes from up here, and then we have one full page, and here we are starting the end of it right there. We're going to start the end of that first full page, and then we have another full page and a third full page, and then it ends here. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the alternative response, which is to be transformed. So let's read and see if we can possibly get to the end of this in the 15 minutes we have left. I will not make nearly as many comments. If I need to make comments, then we won't finish. So let's see what happens. Boy, it's so hard for me to manipulate my iPad. Okay, so beginning up here. But people emerge from terrible pasts to do good and not evil, although such an accomplishment can seem superhuman. Now I'm going to read. I have met people who managed to do it. So, who managed to emerge. Hold on. Oh, now my thing doesn't want to work at all. He's met people who have managed to have terrible things happen and not become bitter. I know a man, he says, a great artist who emerged from just such a school as the one described by Panzram. So this artist was brutalized and betrayed and abused as a child. Only this man was thrown into it as a 5-year-old, fresh from a long stretch in a hospital where he had suffered measles, mumps, and chickenpox simultaneously. So this artist that Jordan Peterson knows, went into an institution where he was betrayed and brutalized and abused as a little 5-year-old child who had been in the hospital with terrible illnesses. And then he went to this institution where he was abused. Okay? Incapable of speaking the language of the school. So maybe the kid spoke Spanish and went to an English institution or school, something like that. Deliberately isolated from his family, abused, starved, and otherwise tormented, he emerged an angry, broken young man. Okay, so that's like Panzram. He hurt himself badly in the aftermath with drugs and alcohol and other forms of self-destructive behavior. He detested everyone, God, himself, and blind fate. So, at first, he had the response that we were talking about before. But he put an end to it all, to all of that. He stopped drinking, stopped hating people, although it still emerges in flashes. Probably this guy is a client of Jordan Peterson, because Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist. So this guy probably came as a client, and that's why Jordan Peterson knows that the hatred comes back in flashes. He revitalized the artistic culture of his native tradition. So the guy's an Indian, like a Native American. And he did positive things with the artistic culture. And he's trained young men to continue in his footsteps. So he helped other people. He produced a 50-foot totem pole memorializing the events of his life and a canoe 40 feet long from a single log, of a kind rarely if ever produced now. So these are accomplishments. He brought his family together and held a great potlatch with 16 hours of dancing and hundreds of people in attendance to express his grief and to make peace with the past. So he definitely dealt with his issues very creatively. He decided to be a good person and then did the impossible things required to live that way. So this is one example of a person who transformed instead of getting vengeance. Now we'll have another example of someone. I had a client, another client, who did not have good parents. Her mother died when she was very young. Hold on. I'm going to get another color. We'll go for that one. Her mother died when she was very young. Her grandmother, who raised her, was a harridan. That's a woman who screams a lot and is mean, bitter, and over-concerned with appearances. So she would maybe punish the girl for getting her dress dirty, even if the girl didn't really do anything morally wrong. She mistreated her granddaughter, punishing her for her virtues, creativity, sensitivity, and intelligence. Unable to resist, acting out her resentment for an admittedly hard life on her granddaughter. So this grandmother treated the child who was Jordan's client very badly because the grandmother had had a hard life. It says, admittedly, she had a hard life. So it's like, yeah, she had a hard life, but she should have resisted taking it out on her granddaughter, but she didn't. So the grandmother brutalized the little girl. The little girl had a better relationship with her father than with her grandmother, but the father was an addict who died badly while she cared for him. So her father was an addict, like maybe alcohol or drugs, and he had a terrible death while he was in the care of his daughter. My client, that girl, had a son. She perpetuated none of this with him. That means she did not do to her son what grandmother had done to her. He grew up truthful, independent, and hardworking, and smart. Instead of widening the tear in the cultural fabric that she had inherited and transmitting it down to her son and grandchildren, she sewed up the cultural tear. A tear is like a rip in the culture. She repaired the culture. She repaired the tear in the cultural fabric. She rejected the sins of her forefathers. Such things can be done. He was saying before, it's natural for if someone is mean to you, you will be mean back. But now he's saying, no, it is possible to absorb the evil and be transformed and become something good. Distress, whether psychic, physical, or intellectual, need not at all produce nihilism. So need not means it does not have to produce nihilism, and this at all makes it even bigger, amplifies the sentiment. So distress does not need to produce nihilism at all. It definitely does not need to produce nihilism. So all the previous paragraphs that we read saying you are justified in being a mass murderer, he's saying none of that is true. So nihilism, that is the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. This being the definition he is using for nihilism. It need not produce the radical rejection of value, meaning, and desirability. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretations. So you can either become nihilistic or you can transform. Vengeance or transformation. Nietzsche wrote those words. Nietzsche is the one who said that distress need not produce nihilism. Distress always permits a variety of interpretations. It does not mandate nihilism. Nietzsche wrote those words. What he meant was this: people who experience evil may certainly desire to perpetuate it. In other words, to do to their children what was done to them, thus perpetuating evil down the generations. or to pay it forward. That means the same thing. To pay it forward means to do to those you meet what has been done to you in the past. That's paying it forward. Usually we use pay it forward as a positive. Like if someone gives me or does a favor for me or gives me a gift and I say, oh, I want to pay you back, they say, pay it forward. And what they mean is do the same for someone else someday, thus expanding the impact of the good deed. That's what pay it forward means. Okay, so what Nietzsche meant was this: people who experience evil may certainly desire to perpetuate the evil and pay it forward, widening the circle of evil, but it is also possible to learn good by experiencing evil. That's weird. You're going to learn good by experiencing evil. How does that work? A bullied boy can mimic his tormentors. So a boy who is a victim of bullies can go to a younger group of children and be a bully toward them just the way it was done to him. But alternatively, he can also learn from his own abuse that it is wrong to push people around. Push someone around is to bully them and make their lives miserable. Someone tormented by her mother can learn from her own terrible experiences how important it is to be a good parent. Many, perhaps even most, of the adults who abuse children were abused themselves as children. So many people who abuse children were themselves abused, but, or however, the majority of people who are abused do not go on to abuse their own children. This is a well-established fact, which can be demonstrated simply and arithmetically in this way. If one parent abused 3 children and each of the 3 children had 3 children and so on, and they all perpetuated the abuse, there would be 3 abusers in the first generation, 9 in the second, 27 in the third, etc. '81 in the fourth, and so on exponentially. After 20 generations, more than 10 billion people would have suffered childhood abuse, more people than currently inhabit the planet. And we know that's not the case. Instead, abuse disappears across generations. People constrain its spread. That is a testament to the genuine dominance of good over evil in the human heart. Okay, we're going to have to stop there. That's a nice positive place to stop. So it looks like I think this is a good stopping place. He's saying that transformation maybe is the most common result of experiencing suffering in this world. So we'll see you next week.